The Las Vegas sun had barely risen when the first residents of Silver Mirage condominiums discovered the envelopes taped to their doors. The complex, an aging set of sand-colored buildings huddled between a busy arterial road and an expanse of undeveloped desert, had always carried a faint undertone of tension. Years of deferred maintenance, leadership disputes, and simmering resentments had created a quiet but persistent hum of anxiety among the people who lived there. Yet nothing in its turbulent past matched the shock waiting inside the crisp white papers delivered that morning. The HOA board had issued announcements before, reminders about parking violations, warnings about pet noise, notices about the community pool needing temporary closures. But this envelope carried a weight that could be felt even before it was opened. The residents sensed it instinctively, as if the air itself held its breath. And when they finally unfolded the letter, the complex seemed to inhale sharply with them. The document explained that the community's financial condition had reached what the board referred to as a critical and unsustainable deficit. The roof replacements, plumbing overhauls, security upgrades, and insurance premiums had all snowballed beyond prediction. The reserves were nearly empty. A reckoning had arrived. As a result, the board announced that the total monthly association fees, regular dues plus a newly imposed special assessment, would rise from $500 to an astonishing $490 additional per month, bringing the new total to nearly $990 for some units. The figure sat on the page like a threat. For many residents, especially retirees who lived on fixed incomes, the number instantly translated into panic. They imagined prescription costs colliding with overdue HOA bills. They envisioned Social Security checks vanishing before groceries were bought. And they felt insult rising beside fear, because none of them remembered being told that the financial situation had grown this dire. Silver Mirage was the kind of place filled with people who had chosen modest living because it fit their limitations. Veterans surviving on pensions, widows living alone, casino workers pulling long night shifts, Uber drivers squeezing rent from inconsistent pay, families who had bought small units hoping to slowly build stability, they all shared the same stucco structures, the same cracked walkways, the same weary palm trees. Now they shared something else, a betrayal they did not see coming. As the news spread door to door like a desert brush fire, a current of agitation swept through the complex. Groups formed in courtyards, on stairwells, in the lobby near the vending machine that had been broken for months. The early hour didn't matter. People gathered in pajamas, robes, slippers, and jackets thrown hastily over nightclothes. Many carried the letter folded in their hands, clutched tightly as if it might disappear if they didn't hang on to it. At the center of the swelling discontent were the seniors. Silver Mirage had always been marketed as quiet, stable, long-term living, which attracted older residents. For them, the fee hike felt like a forced eviction masked as policy. They had spent years carefully budgeting their modest incomes around the existing dues, believing the HOA would maintain predictable costs. Now, the increase threatened to push them out entirely. One elderly resident found herself calculating whether she could cut her food budget in half. Another wondered if she could sell her car, even though it was her only transport to medical appointments. Others simply stared at the letter, trying to understand how a community could allow itself to reach such a precarious state without giving warnings. The HOA board, for its part, had expected pushback, but not the volcanic reaction that erupted before noon. The board president, a woman with a rigid sense of procedure and an unwavering belief that she was doing what was necessary, had believed the residents would grudgingly accept the hike once the severity of the financial collapse was explained. But her confidence underestimated the storm she was about to face. As day pushed into afternoon, residents began sharing stories of past board mismanagement, unfinished repairs, poorly documented expenditures, multiple vendors hired and dismissed without explanation. The more they talked, the more the narrative shifted from financial emergency to suspected negligence. People who had never cared about HOA politics suddenly leaned forward, alert and angry, sensing that the board had hidden something. The letter stated that an urgent emergency meeting would be held the following week to discuss the increase, but for many residents, waiting 7 days felt intolerable. Some demanded an immediate explanation, Others began calling local housing advocates and Las Vegas community rights organizations. Younger, tech-savvy residents posted photos of the notice on social media, where outrage quickly gathered momentum from strangers who recognized predatory HOA escalation when they saw it. By late afternoon, the heat of the day amplified the heat of the conflict. The concrete walkways sizzled beneath the Nevada sun, mirroring the frustration growing inside every building. Even those who usually avoided community confrontations found themselves swept into the collective fury, because the burden was simply too heavy for any individual to ignore. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the parking lot, a sense of unity formed, an unexpected solidarity born from shared desperation. People who had barely spoken to each other in years stood side by side, united by the realization that the board's decision threatened not just their finances but their ability to remain in their homes. And for the first time, a collective thought emerged, quiet at first, then growing stronger as it spread. This wasn't just a fee increase. This was a fight for survival. And they would not accept it without a battle. The uproar that spread across Silver Mirage in the hours after the fee hike announcement did not fade overnight. Instead, it solidified into something sharper, more organized, and far more dangerous to the HOA board than the shocked confusion of the first day. By morning, the complex had shifted from disbelief to determination. Fear was still present, but it hardened into a resolve that made the hallways feel electric. In the early hours, when the desert air was still cool and the sand dunes outside the property were bathed in pale blue light, a few residents met informally in the community mailroom. What began as a cluster of concerned individuals quickly became the nucleus of a full-scale resistance effort. These were not seasoned activists. They were retirees gripping folders of bills, young service workers balancing side jobs, single parents juggling obligations, and long-term owners who had weathered previous HOA storms. But in their collective anxiety, a new kind of strength emerged. One resident, a former accountant with decades of experience reading financial statements, brought an entire binder of past HOA budgets, reserve studies, and annual reports. He had saved the documents out of habit, never expecting they would one day become weapons. As he flipped through the pages, the others studied the numbers with growing unease. The financial decline of Silver Mirage had not been abrupt. It had been gradual, steady, and obvious in hindsight. But the board had downplayed each deficit, framing every shortfall as temporary. Maintenance delays were always blamed on scheduling issues, not a lack of funds. Reserve withdrawals were labeled emergency authorizations, even when the emergencies seemed suspiciously routine. For the first time, the residents understood that the warning signs had been there for years. They had simply been obscured by optimistic phrasing and vague promises made at annual meetings that few attended. Now, with their livelihoods at stake, people who once dismissed HOA paperwork as tedious found themselves poring over spreadsheets with the intensity of auditors. As the informal meetings expanded, residents who rarely interacted began stepping into leadership roles. One woman who had survived years of corporate bureaucracy instinctively took charge of organizing information. She created timelines of board decisions, categorized expenses, and assembled a list of vendors whose contracts had abruptly ended. Others contributed community observations, the uncompleted roof sealant project, the half-finished landscaping renovation, and the security camera installation that had drained thousands yet delivered a mere handful of functioning devices. The more they uncovered, the more the narrative shifted. What had initially appeared as financial incompetence began resembling something deeper, an erosion of accountability, perhaps even negligence. Some residents quietly wondered whether the board had known the reserves were collapsing but avoided announcing the truth to protect their own reputations. Whether that suspicion was fair or not mattered less than the fact that people believed it. Distrust had taken root, and the fee hike had watered it. Outside the mailroom, the complex looked much the same: sun-faded walls, cracked pavement, and the distant hum of Las Vegas traffic, but the atmosphere had changed. Residents walked with purpose. Conversations murmured through balconies. Papers were exchanged in parking lots. The faint sense of resignation that had long lingered over Silver Mirage was replaced by something unfamiliar: coordination. By late afternoon, the rebellion expanded beyond conversation and paperwork. A group of tenants who lived in the older buildings began canvassing door to door, knocking politely on units that had remained quiet since the notice. Many lived alone, had mobility issues, or struggled with English as a second language. The canvassing group explained the situation patiently, offering printed summaries of the proposed fee increase written in clear, simple terms. For these residents, the discovery that they were not alone brought visible relief. Anxiety turned into solidarity, and solidarity became motivation. Meanwhile, in a corner unit overlooking the central courtyard, a tech-savvy younger resident created an online forum specifically for Silver Mirage homeowners and tenants. Within hours, dozens of people joined, uploading photos of crumbling staircases, malfunctioning lights, flooded laundry rooms, and peeling ceilings, evidence of long-neglected repairs despite the board's repeated claims that maintenance funding was insufficient. The forum became a repository of frustration, but also a strategic tool. Patterns emerged: neglected upkeep in certain buildings, inconsistent vendor responses, and repeated delays in projects that had been fully funded years earlier. The online group quickly attracted external attention. A local housing rights organization, alerted by a resident who shared the fee notice on social media, reached out with an offer to guide the community in reviewing their legal options. Another group specializing in HOA transparency offered advice on obtaining financial disclosures. The residents realized they were no longer confined to the boundaries of their complex. They had allies watching, advising, and amplifying their cause. As momentum grew, the HOA board noticed the shift. Board members who had assumed the outrage would dissipate by the end of the week instead witnessed clusters of residents gathered around picnic tables late into the night. They saw neighbors swapping documents, comparing decades of dues history, and studying the community bylaws with an intensity no one had ever displayed at official meetings. The board president, who had expected her usual firm tone to inspire compliance, found herself facing a community that no longer accepted her quiet authority. Inside the board office, a sense of unease settled. The emergency meeting scheduled for the following week was originally intended as a formality, a controlled environment where the board would present its justification and announce that the decision was final, however unpleasant. But the board now understood that the meeting might instead become an arena for confrontation. The residents were not merely upset, they were organized. The rumblings of confrontation echoed in every hallway. People rehearsed explanations of their hardships, prepared to demonstrate how the increase would devastate their finances. Others collected photographs of the complex's deteriorating infrastructure to counter the board's claims of essential improvements. A retired veteran meticulously documented every unfulfilled project from the last 5 years, assembling an unofficial audit that circulated across the complex like a manifesto. Evenings stretched into late-night gatherings as the residents realized they were building not only a rebellion but a community. People who had lived only feet apart for years finally learned each other's names, stories, and struggles. Bonds formed where isolation had once reigned. And with these bonds came a new collective identity. They were no longer passive tenants of a failing HOA. They were stakeholders, fighters, and witnesses to a system they now intended to hold accountable. By the time the sun rose the next day, it was clear to everyone that the rebellion had fully ignited. The residents of Silver Mirage were no longer reacting. They were preparing for war. As the days ticked toward the emergency HOA meeting, Silver Mirage transformed from a quiet condominium complex into a hive of investigation. What began as scattered frustration had evolved into a focused mission to uncover the truth behind the sudden financial catastrophe. Every resident felt the pressure of the approaching confrontation, and their determination intensified as new layers of irregularities surfaced. By now, the community had divided itself into working groups, each tackling a different dimension of the crisis. Some monitored upcoming legal options, others documented maintenance failures, and a particularly persistent trio focused their efforts on unraveling the financial records. Their mission began with the HOA's annual budgets and reserve disclosures, the very documents most residents had previously ignored. Now, those dusty papers carried the weight of a possible scandal. As they combed through years of paperwork spread across coffee tables, kitchen counters, and community benches, patterns began to emerge. The line items for certain maintenance categories fluctuated dramatically from year to year without clear explanations. Landscaping expenses had doubled over a 2-year period despite the community's grounds appearing increasingly barren and neglected. A large security system upgrade listed at tens of thousands of dollars had produced only a handful of functional cameras. The roof repair allocations were especially baffling. Multiple large sums had been budgeted over the years, yet residents could easily point to water damage, mold patches, and sagging ceilings that testified otherwise. Even more concerning was the discovery of repeated emergency reserve withdrawals, each vaguely justified as essential for preventing major structural issues. Yet no corresponding improvements were ever recorded or visible. The more they examined, the more the financial trail resembled not a budget but a maze, one designed to obscure rather than inform. Frustration grew into suspicion as residents compared contractor invoices. A long-term owner unearthed receipts from vendors who had worked on the property in years past. These invoices, when matched against the HOA's official financial statements, revealed discrepancies. Some amounts did not align, others were listed under slightly altered vendor names, and certain line items appeared twice under different expense categories. Nothing proved wrongdoing on its own, but the inconsistencies painted a troubling portrait of disorganization at best and mismanagement, or worse, at worst. Outside of paperwork, residents gathered photographic evidence of structural neglect. They documented broken stair rails that had remained unstable for years, cracked asphalt in the parking lot that continued to deepen each season, and peeling exterior paint that had flaked off buildings despite recent appearance improvement charges in the budget. The photos spread through the online group, each one fueling the growing sense that the HOA board had not only failed in its duties but had done so while extracting more and more funds from the very people it was meant to protect. As the evidence amassed, the emotional stakes rose. Seniors who had initially felt defeated now saw a collective effort fighting for their survival. Younger residents who had once remained indifferent began contributing their time and skills. Families with little to spare found strength in the knowledge that their neighbors were standing beside them. These alliances forged in urgency became the backbone of the rebellion. The board, meanwhile, had grown increasingly uneasy. While they attempted to maintain normal operations, the atmosphere in the office shifted noticeably. The board president, long accustomed to quiet compliance from residents, realized the community had reached a tipping point. The resistance had structure, leadership, and momentum, 3 things the board was wholly unprepared to confront. More concerning was the flow of document requests the residents had begun submitting. Under Nevada law, homeowners were entitled to certain financial transparency, and the sudden surge in record inquiries put pressure on the board's administration. In response, some records were released, though often in incomplete or heavily summarized form. But even these partial disclosures raised alarms. Reserve balances appeared lower than expected, vendor payments were clustered oddly, and certain expenses seemed to vanish without clear categorization. Residents who had once assumed incompetence began whispering about the possibility of deeper misconduct. The tension grew heavier with each passing day. When board members walked the property, they felt the eyes of residents following them, not with hostility but with expectation. The community wanted answers, and the board had nothing reassuring to offer. Meanwhile, the local housing rights group that had been monitoring the situation noted the growing evidence of governance failure. They advised residents on the possibility of forcing a special recall election if the board refused to justify the financial decisions. In the evenings, the courtyard became the heart of the resistance. People gathered with notebooks, printouts, laptops, and old receipts saved out of habit. The air buzzed with calculations, theories, and shared revelations. The online forum turned into a living archive of the community's fight, every photo, discrepancy, and story captured as proof of the deteriorating conditions. Each bit of evidence strengthened the resolve to confront the board head-on. Through it all, a single question grew louder. How had the HOA allowed the reserves to collapse so severely that a nearly $490 per month increase seemed like the only solution? The residents believed they already knew part of the answer. They had endured years of delays, excuses, and vague assurances. They had watched money vanish into incomplete projects and questionable expenses. Now, with the whole community united, they were ready to demand accountability in front of the entire board. As the day of the emergency meeting approached, Silver Mirage hummed with a sense of inevitability. No one expected the gathering to be calm or orderly. The residents were preparing not just to ask questions but to expose the truth. The board, cornered and defensive, braced for impact. The stage was set. The documents were assembled. The evidence was ready. The evening of the emergency HA meeting arrived with an atmosphere so tense it seemed to warp the very air within Silver Mirage. Residents streamed toward the community hall long before the scheduled start time, forming clusters along the walkway and at the doors. The desert sky was streaked with orange and deepening red, casting dramatic shadows across the complex, shadows that mirrored the emotional state of the people gathering beneath them. The energy was unmistakable. People had come prepared for confrontation. Inside, the room filled beyond capacity. Extra chairs were dragged in. Some residents stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. Others waited outside, listening through open windows. Every face carried a mix of exhaustion, anger, and burning determination. Folders of documents sat in laps, notebooks were held open, and phones were ready to record. The once passive community now resembled a crowd on the brink of uprising. When the HOA board finally appeared, the shift was palpable. Their stiff postures, carefully arranged papers, and strained expressions betrayed the pressure they were under. The board president entered last, her demeanor rigid, as if she believed strict formality would restore the control that had already slipped far beyond her grasp. She took her seat at the center of the table, flanked by other board members who avoided the eyes of the crowd. The meeting began with procedural motions, but residents felt the unease radiating from the board's posture. The board's explanation for the nearly $490 per month increase unfolded in a rehearsed, mechanical fashion. They referenced inflation, vendor costs, and long overdue repairs, painting a picture of unavoidable financial crisis. But as they spoke, the residents recognized the same vague assurances and polished wording that had masked the truth for years. The explanations lacked specificity, lacked numerical clarity, and lacked the accountability the community demanded. What followed was an eruption of collective force. Residents rose one after another, presenting documented evidence of inconsistent expenses, unexplained reserve withdrawals, missing repair reports, and years of deferred maintenance. They described hardships the increase would inflict: seniors forced to choose between medication and housing, families facing displacement, workers who could barely meet the current dues. Their voices grew stronger as they laid out the patterns they had uncovered: projects budgeted multiple times but never completed, vendors paid without results, and reserve balances dwindling far too quickly. The board president attempted to maintain composure, but the pressure mounted visibly. As residents presented photographs of crumbling infrastructure and documentation of years of mismanagement, the atmosphere turned heavier. The weight of the evidence undermined the board's narrative. The crowd sensed it. The board sensed it. The cracks in the official story were now undeniable. When the residents demanded full financial transparency, complete ledgers, vendor contracts, reserve studies, and expenditure histories, the board's hesitation deepened the distrust. The president's insistence on delayed disclosure, citing administrative limitations, only fueled suspicion that something far worse lay beneath the surface. The meeting surged past its scheduled hour with no resolution. The board attempted to end discussions, but the residents refused. They had come for answers and left with only more questions. And in their frustration, a new decision crystallized within the community: if the board would not protect them, they would replace it. The night ended with the crowd dispersing into the courtyard, shaken but united. Something irreversible had begun. In the days following the explosive meeting, Silver Mirage entered a phase of intense mobilization. The residents who had once been isolated by apathy or exhaustion now acted with synchronized purpose. The online forum swelled with new members. Volunteers canvassed door to door with petitions. Retirees, who once spent their mornings quietly tending plants or reading newspapers, joined strategy discussions, their decades of life experience becoming essential assets. The recall process required signatures, many of them, but gathering them proved easier than expected. With each knock on a door, residents offered not just support but new stories of neglect. Some revealed leaks that had gone unaddressed for years, resulting in warped flooring and mold creeping beneath paint. Others mentioned air conditioning units failing during summer heat waves because routine servicing had been skipped. One tenant recounted the slow collapse of a balcony railing, reported repeatedly yet ignored. As these stories accumulated, a troubling theme emerged. The board had not merely mishandled finances, it had repeatedly dismissed urgent maintenance issues, seemingly hoping that short-term fixes or avoidance would delay the financial reckoning. Instead, it had only magnified the cost and risk. A breakthrough occurred when a long-term owner unearthed a binder filled with past engineering assessments. These documents, forgotten in her storage closet, revealed that structural problems had been flagged years earlier, with explicit recommendations for immediate repairs. Yet, none of the recommended fixes appeared in subsequent budgets. Instead, funds had been channeled towards smaller cosmetic projects that had done little to address core issues but created the illusion of progress. The community studied every page. The more they uncovered, the more the fee increase looked less like an unavoidable adjustment and more like the culmination of years of avoidance and questionable decisions. Armed with documentation, the residents prepared for the recall election, confident they now had both the numbers and the evidence to dismantle the board's authority. The momentum was unstoppable. Even residents who had remained neutral now joined the movement, recognizing the crisis threatened everyone, regardless of personal circumstances. Meanwhile, the board members retreated into defensive silence. Their occasional appearances on the property were brief and anxious. Rumors circulated that one board member was considering resigning before the recall took place. Another had been seen shredding papers in her garage, which only fueled speculation. The board president, once stern and composed, avoided communal areas altogether, her determination eroded by the growing rebellion. As the recall petition reached the required threshold far ahead of schedule, residents prepared for the decisive vote. The community had become something wholly new, aware, vocal, and empowered. The day of the recall vote felt like a turning point not just for Silver Mirage, but for every resident who had weathered the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks. The community hall, once a sterile gathering space, now held the weight of history. Residents arrived early, lining the walkway, clutching ballots, and exchanging encouraging nods. The energy was calmer than at the emergency meeting, but it carried a quiet intensity, a belief that change was not just possible but imminent. The board members, seated at the front table, looked diminished. Their rigid confidence had faded into resignation. Weeks of scrutiny, accusations, and evidence had worn them down. Even the board president's normally commanding presence appeared subdued, as though she already understood the outcome. Ballots were cast with steady precision. Residents who rarely engaged in community governance treated their vote like a final stand. Seniors who had feared displacement now held a sense of hope. Families who had worried about losing their homes felt their burden lighten. The act of voting became a symbolic reclamation of power. When the counting began, silence filled the hall. Row after row of tallied votes revealed overwhelming support for removal. The recall succeeded not by a narrow margin, but by a landslide. The board members were officially removed from their positions. A wave of relief rippled through the room, relief mixed with vindication, unity, and the recognition of a long battle finally won. The next step began immediately. An interim committee of residents volunteered to manage essential operations while preparing for a full election of new board members. Their first order of business was transparency. Financial records were gathered for a complete review. Contractors with questionable histories were dismissed. Emergency inspections were scheduled for buildings showing signs of structural risk. Residents, no longer in the dark, contributed time, skills, and oversight. Silver Mirage was far from healed. The financial deficit remained severe. Repairs would take time. Budgets would require restructuring. But for the first time in years, the community felt in control of its future. As the sun set behind the desert skyline, casting warm light over the aging stucco buildings, The people of Silver Mirage stood together with a renewed sense of identity. They had confronted mismanagement, defended their homes, and restored power to the community. And though the challenges ahead were significant, they faced them with a unity forged through hardship. The fee increase had been the spark, but the rebellion had become the transformation.